The liberation of Nazi concentration camps in the final months of the Second World War confronted the Allied armies with an unprecedented moral and historical reality. While the Allied war effort had long been justified in political rhetoric as a struggle against tyranny and aggression, it was only through direct encounters with the camps that many soldiers, journalists, and policymakers fully grasped the systematic nature of Nazi mass murder. Among these sites, the concentration camp at Dachau occupies a particularly significant place in both historical memory and scholarly debate. Liberated by units of the United States Army on the 29th of April 1945, Dachau became one of the earliest and most widely reported symbols of Nazi brutality encountered by Western Allied forces. Yet the events that followed its liberation complicate any simple narrative of moral clarity or unambiguous justice. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, several SS guards were killed by American soldiers and, in some cases, by liberated prisoners. Some of these killings occurred during combat situations, while others took place after German personnel had surrendered. These incidents, often referred to collectively as the Dachau reprisals, have generated sustained controversy within historical scholarship. They raise fundamental questions about the limits of lawful violence, the psychological impact of encountering atrocity, and the application of military justice under extreme circumstances. More broadly, they challenge the assumption that the liberators of the camps operated entirely outside the moral ambiguities that characterized total war. This study is concerned not primarily with judging the actions of individual soldiers, but with examining how such events were situated or conspicuously not situated within the political and moral discourse of Allied leaders. In particular, it addresses a recurring question in public history and popular discourse. How did senior Allied leaders respond to reports that Allied soldiers had killed SS guards following the liberation of concentration camps? And what does their response, or lack thereof, reveal about wartime governance, moral responsibility, and historical memory? Within this framework, the case of Winston S. Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and one of the most prominent Allied leaders of the war, serves as a focal point. Churchill's role as a wartime leader has been extensively studied, and his rhetorical condemnation of Nazi tyranny and barbarism is well documented. He frequently framed the war against Germany as a civilizational struggle, invoking the defense of law, humanity, and moral order. At the same time, historical research has failed to uncover any direct, documented response by Churchill to the killings of SS personnel at Dachau by American troops. This absence has often been interpreted, particularly in non-academic contexts, as either tacit approval or deliberate moral evasion. Such interpretations, however, risk oversimplifying both the historical record and the political realities of Allied decision-making in the war's final weeks. The central research problem of this thesis is therefore not the reconstruction of a missing statement, but the historical analysis of silence itself. What does it mean, in methodological and interpretive terms, when a senior political leader does not comment on a specific instance of violence committed by an Allied force? How should historians distinguish between ignorance, indifference, strategic restraint, and structural limitations of authority? And how does the absence of commentary shape subsequent narratives of moral accountability in the context of mass atrocity? To address these questions, this study situates the Dachau reprisals within a broader analytical framework that combines military history, political history, and moral philosophy. It treats the killings not as isolated acts, but as events embedded within overlapping systems, the psychological trauma of frontline soldiers, the legal frameworks governing wartime conduct, and the diplomatic relationships among Allied powers. Churchill's silence, in this context, is examined not as an anomaly, but as a case study in the governance of coalition warfare and the management of moral narratives during and after conflict. A key methodological challenge lies in separating contemporary evidence from retrospective myth-making. In recent decades, especially with the rise of digital media, claims have circulated asserting that Churchill explicitly approved of, praised, or dismissed the killings of SS guards at Dachau. Such claims often appear without citation, or rely on secondary anecdotes rather than primary documentation. A rigorous historical approach requires careful examination of archival sources, including speeches, cabinet minutes, correspondence, and memoirs, as well as a critical assessment of what these sources do not contain. As historians such as Carlo Ginzburg have argued, absence in the archive is itself a form of evidence, but one that must be handled with methodological caution rather than speculative certainty. This study adopts a source-critical methodology grounded in established historical practice. It draws on published collections of Churchill's wartime speeches, official British government records, American military investigation reports, and post-war historical analyses of Dachau. While it does not claim to provide new archival discoveries, it seeks to synthesize existing scholarship in a way that clarifies persistent misconceptions and reframes the debate around leadership responsibility and moral discourse. The use of constructed, academic citations in this work serves a pedagogical purpose, modeling proper scholarly form rather than asserting the discovery of. The broader historiographical context of this study is shaped by two parallel developments. First, there has been an increasing scholarly willingness to examine Allied misconduct during the Second World War without collapsing moral distinctions between aggressor and defender. Historians such as Omer Bartov and Richard Overwy have emphasized that acknowledging Allied transgressions does not relativize Nazi crimes, but rather strengthens historical credibility by resisting hagiography. Second, Holocaust studies have increasingly focused on the moment of liberation as a distinct historical phase, characterized by chaos, violence, and moral disorientation rather than immediate redemption. Dachau exemplifies this transitional moment, in which the end of systematic murder did not instantly produce order or justice. Within this historiographical landscape, Churchill's position is especially instructive. As a leader who consistently articulated the war in moral terms, his lack of commentary on specific Allied reprisals forces historians to confront the limits of moral rhetoric in practice. Also highlights the division of authority within the Allied coalition. Churchill was neither commander-in-chief of American forces or responsible for U.S. military justice. Public intervention on such matters could have risked diplomatic friction at a moment when Allied unity remained strategically vital, particularly with the war against Japan ongoing and post-war negotiations with the Soviet Union looming. This study therefore argues that Churchill's silence should be interpreted not as an ethical judgment on the Dachau killings themselves, but as a reflection of the structural and political constraints under which Allied leaders operated. Silence, in this sense, functioned as a form of governance, implicit recognition that certain issues were to be handled within national chains of command rather than through public moral pronouncement. Such an interpretation does not absolve leaders of moral responsibility, but it reframes responsibility as collective, diffused, and institutionally mediated rather than purely personal. The structure of the thesis reflects this analytical approach. Following this introductory chapter, the next section examines the historical development of Dachau within the Nazi camp system and its symbolic significance by 1945. Subsequent chapters analyze the experience of American troops during liberation, the documented reprisals against SS personnel, and the U.S. Army's internal investigation. Later sections turn to Churchill's wartime political philosophy, his public rhetoric on Nazi crimes, and the absence of commentary on Allied violence. The final chapters engage with post-war historiography and ethical debates, assessing how Dachau has been remembered and instrumentalized in broader narratives of the Second World War. The concentration camp at Dachau occupies a central place in the history of Nazi repression, not only because of its longevity, but also because of its function as a model for the broader camp system that developed across the Third Reich. Established in March 1933, only weeks after Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, Dachau was the first permanent concentration camp created by the Nazi regime. Its early history reveals that the camp system was not initially conceived as a mechanism of mass extermination, but rather as a tool of political terror, social control, and ideological enforcement. Understanding this evolution is essential to contextualizing both the atrocities uncovered in 1945 and the psychological shock experienced by Allied soldiers upon liberation. Dachau was originally designed to incarcerate political opponents of the Nazi Party, particularly communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other perceived enemies of the new regime. Heinrich Himmler, then Munich's police chief and later head of the SS, described the camp as a necessary measure to restore order in a nation allegedly threatened by internal subversion. From its inception, Dachau operated outside the normal legal framework, relying on protective custody, Schutzhaft to imprison individuals indefinitely without trial. This extrajudicial status established a precedent that would later become a defining feature of the entire camp system. During the 1930s, Dachau evolved from a site of improvised repression into a highly structured institution of violence. The SS developed standardized routines of discipline, punishment, and surveillance, including forced labor, corporal punishment, and psychological degradation. Crucially, Dachau also functioned as a training center for SS guards, many of whom were later deployed to other camps such as Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Auschwitz. In this sense, Dachau was not merely one camp among many, but a laboratory for the techniques and practices that would later facilitate mass murder on an unprecedented scale. The camp's population expanded steadily as Nazi racial and social policies radicalized. Following the passage of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935 and the intensification of anti-Semitic persecution, Jews were increasingly incarcerated at Dachau alongside Roma, homosexual men, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so-called asocials. The November pogrom of 1938 Kristallnacht marked a turning point, as thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to Dachau in a wave of terror designed to accelerate emigration expropriation. While mass killing was not yet the primary function of the camp, death through starvation, disease, exhaustion, and abuse became a routine outcome of imprisonment. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Dachau entered a new phase. The camp's function expanded to include the exploitation of forced labor for the German war economy. Prisoners were deployed to satellite camps and labor details, working under lethal conditions in armaments production, construction, and other industries deemed vital to the right. Mortality rates rose sharply, particularly after 1942, as overcrowding, malnutrition, and epidemic disease overwhelmed the camp's infrastructure. Although Dachau was not an extermination camp in the technical sense, lacking gas chambers designed for industrial killing, it nonetheless became a site of systematic death. By the time of liberation, an estimated 41,500 prisoners had died there. The final months of the war intensified the camp's brutality. As Allied forces advanced from both east and west, the SS evacuated prisoners from camps closer to the front lines, sending tens of thousands on forced marches or overcrowded transports toward camps deeper within Germany. Dachau became a major destination in this chaotic process, receiving prisoners in catastrophic condition. The arrival of evacuation trains filled with corpses and dying prisoners profoundly shaped the scene encountered by American troops in April 1945. These trains were not aberrations, but the culmination of years of institutionalized violence compounded by the collapse of the Nazi state. Dachau's symbolic significance by 1945 was therefore immense. It represented the continuity of Nazi repression from the regime's earliest days to its final collapse. Yet this continuity was not fully understood by Allied soldiers at the moment of liberation. While reports of Nazi atrocities had circulated throughout the war, they were often abstract, filtered through intelligence summaries or refugee testimony. The physical reality of the camp, the smell of death, the sight of emaciated survivors, the presence of unburied corpses produced a visceral confrontation that exceeded prior knowledge. Many soldiers later described Dachau as a moment that shattered their assumptions about the nature of the enemy and the meaning of the war. This encounter must be understood within the broader framework of wartime psychology.